So think of it this way. Your first 25% is Act 1. The next 50% is Act 2. And then the last 25% is Act 3. And people will even look at, when you get into novel writing and screenwriting, they'll even break Act 2 up into two pieces. It'll be like Act 2A and Act 2B, because when you're at that midpoint, you're in between Act 2A and Act 2B. At that midpoint, your main character is going through a very intense emotional situation, whether it's good or bad. So the build up to that intense situation and then the build up to the end of Act 2 kind of creates two separate stories right there. So a lot of people say Act 1 and Act 2 and Act 3, but they can do Act 1, Act 2A, Act 2B, Act 3. When you have good stories like that, it just helps you structure it to finalize it and make it just a little bit better and make it a little bit more sense. Because your audience's reaction, the feedback from the audience is the true test. It's like, well, how did the audience respond and what were their questions afterwards? So my response to you was an audience response. I wanted to know what your dad and grandpa thought, after all that. Are they as unique as my dad and grandpa, And then when I find out that they are, I realize that Brad and I have more in common than I thought, and then I feel more connected to you. And if we want to talk about sales, I'd be more inclined to buy whatever it is you're selling. So write this down if you don't mind. Inciting incident. Inciting, I-N-C-I-T-I-N-G, inciting. Inciting incident happens around the 15% of the story. So in other words, Indiana Jones gets a phone call that the mummy was stolen from the museum in Cairo. Okay, now he's got to make a decision on what he's going to do. So Act 1 is you and your dad, you're going to this event, and the inciting incident is you see Elvis, and now you've got a decision to make. So you go on a journey, and that journey is getting in front of him. And in the midpoint of the story, he pats you on the head. In the midpoint of the story, you're either in a really good place or you're in a really bad place. This is characters, and this is worth writing down. And this is just basic story construction going all the way back to Shakespeare that they don't teach in school. So your character is either on cloud nine or he's in the dumps, or it can be a cloud nine in a different context. It could be excitement or it could be discouraged, right? But your character is going to be going through either one of those. The end of Act 2 is the story ends there. The story ends there by Elvis saying, "How you doing, little man?" And then he moves on and everybody's flabbergasted, right? That's the end of Act 2. So your story could end right there. However, there's some loose ends to tie up, and that's Act 3. And Act 3 is you have inspired adults by your behavior like a child prodigy. And what did and this is not only story, but it's also kind of counseling. What did those adults do with that new information, with that new story? That little boy did that, and that's what happened. How did that impact their decision making for the rest of their lives? It's just a question to think about. And then the way your dad reacted, that all finalizes Act 3, and that's actually where the story ends. Is how were the adults reacting? Compare contrast to the way your dad reacted. And your dad might have said, "Hey, don't ever do something like that again." But one of the things that you're a father of 2 daughters, is that correct? I've lived life long enough to know that your dad probably told that story when you weren't around a few times, and he was probably proud of you. Just based on my life experience. So that right there is, okay, there's 3 acts, right? Act 1 is you and your dad are going to this place. The inciting incident is you see Elvis. There's a midpoint of the story where he does something, so he pats you on the head. And then the end of Act 2 is the story could actually end right there, but we have some loose ends to tie up, and then there's Act 3. If you can structure every story with what I just gave you, you'll nail storytelling every single time. Well, the inciting incident happens within around the 15 to 20% mark of the story. Because you got to get the story going, right? In novel writing and screenwriting, there's a rule that you need to introduce all your characters in the first 25%. So in the first act of your story, introduce all the characters you're going to be talking about. So your dad is there, Elvis is in it, and it's you, right? So you've introduced those folks. One of the things you don't want to do is 80% into the story, suddenly introduce a major character. Don't do that. Go do that in your first 25%. So the inciting incident is happening around the midpoint of the first act, the first 25%. Act 2 is, you're going to see Elvis, and then the midpoint is how you're feeling when he's patting you on the head and all that. But you could just take that formula and you could apply it to every single story you tell on stage, and you would nail it. Yeah. More. If you read a novella, did you know that the Curious Case of Benjamin Button was only 2 or 3 pages long, and they made a 3-hour movie out of it, and it grossed $300 million in the box office? Like, that was a 3-page PDF. It's probably the shortest story I've ever read in my life, The Curious Case of Benjamin Button. But the same rules apply. It doesn't matter if it's 3 pages or 5 pages or 120 pages, that formula is there. You got your 3-act structure, you have your inciting incident, the end of Act 2 is your conflict, and then Act 3 is the resolution. Yeah. Okay, so you got 2 stories there. So the first story the first story of the firefighter, that's a standalone story. Let's break this one down. You ready? So your dad and your grandpa is telling you at 17 to get a real job. Is that correct? I want to know what their reaction is once you start making money at the car dealership. I'm not asking you to tell me now. This is stuff that we'll talk about. Okay. So your dad and your grandpa and you are the characters in this story. You might even paint the picture of what your dad and grandpa are like. How did they grow up? What was life like for them? They tell you at 17 to go get a real job. That's the inciting incident. So you go to the Forest Service and you become a fighter. Well, the midpoint of the story is you realize you're not going to be the hero. You're going to be the piss bag operator. So there's the midpoint of the story. So you're in the slumps, right? So you're on cloud 9. You go to the slumps, but then you're going to be on cloud 9 by the end of the story. So there's your character arc. All right? You realize that that's not for you, and then the end of Act 2 is him showing you his poison oak, and you deciding that you're not going to be the piss bag operator anymore. So the story could end right there. And this is the thing in storytelling, is that the story can always end at the end of Act 2, always. But there's some loose ends to tie up. You go to this car dealership and you realize that you're not going to have to be doing, quote unquote manual labor. You can do this other thing instead and be very successful at it and multiply your money multiple times. The story ends with you being the hero, right? But what I would want to know is, what was your dad and your grandpa's conversations and relationship like when they saw you be successful there at the car dealership? Now, the second story is going to be your life at the car dealership. And you just apply that, like, hey, Act 1, first 25% of the story, introduce everybody. You got your inciting incident in there. Act 2, at the midpoint of the story, what kind of emotional situation am I in? It needs to be different than where I started, or it needs to be different than the way it ends. Act 2 is going to be the end of the story, but then we have this little thing we got to fix. But second of all, as an audience, I'd be like, well, what did his dad and grandpa say about that? When he came home with told the story about the poison oak and said, I'm not going to go be a firefighter anymore. I could use some reactions from your dad and grandpa on that. But then when they saw you be successful at the car dealership, what was their reaction to that? I've seen parents and grandparents get jealous of their kids. I mean, it's ridiculous. I've seen that happen. There's no wrong way to do it, right? It's just a formula. But if I was in the audience, I would want to know, I would want to know, hey, what happened? Everybody's got someone in their life. They're going to react joyfully, or they're going to react skeptically, no matter what kind of news you bring them. So I think it's also a way for you to connect with your audience, for you to say, my dad and my grandpa reacted this way. And I think you're going to have audience members that's going to be like, you know what, that reminds me of my grandpa. That's what my grandpa did. It's just a way to connect with people. There's 4 categories of conflict, all right? Intrapersonal, which is what's going on with you, like you're at war with yourself internally, right? That's intrapersonal. Interpersonal is your conflict with your family, the institution, the government, whatever you want to call it. That's interpersonal. Situational is you bring your musket up in a 17th century story and it won't fire. Well, that sucks because you're about to get your head blown off, right? So that's a situational conflict. And the 4th category of conflict is nature. There's fire, there's a tornado ripping through, a volcano has erupted, the rainstorm is pounding down on us, right? So what you do is you start looking for all of the areas of your story where there's conflict, and you talk about it, because the conflict is what interests people. The rags to riches story is never going to get old. Your dad didn't give you a trust fund, right? I mean, I'm correct on that, right? So you worked hard, right, to get to where you are. And try this one time in an audience where you feel comfortable doing it. What if you're just 100% honest? Just try one public speaking session in front of an audience where you just tell them what actually happened and see how it goes. So let's say you wanted to create characters, or you wanted to kind of categorize characters in your life and just make them more black and white. Like, let's say that it'd be really hard to explain who your grandfather really was, but if you had a certain personality to kind of put him in, he would make more sense to your audience. So for example, what character in the hero's life, these are 5 characters you can look at. What character in the hero's life provokes sadness and cynicism in the hero or the other characters? Number 2, who brings out their laughter, their playful or their hopeful side? Number 3, who inspires them, who encourages them to love and show courage? Number 4, who causes him or her to cower in fear or strike out in anger? And number 5, who inspires them or gives them hope, and how does that happen? And what happens is those characters interacting with the hero shows us, we get a sense of, we feel like we've seen every single emotion of the hero throughout the story, and it makes us understand the hero a lot better. We've seen them crying, we've seen them happy, we've seen them excited, we've seen them defeated, but then we see them rise from the ashes. So those kind of characters are in there. There's also, I don't know if you've ever heard of the Enneagram. Have you heard of Enneagram? Yeah, okay, so my bachelor's degree, I went to college, I went to grad school. My bachelor's degree was counseling, and I took every single one of those personality exams that you can think of, DISC, all of them. None of them were really that satisfying, and I'm going to send this material to you, okay? But there was one called the Enneagram. It asks you 200 questions, and you answer all of them, and it will tell you out of the set, according to them, there are 7 personalities of humans, and you're going to fit one of them. Yeah, you're going to have some traits of one of the others, but the majority of you is going to fit one of 7 personalities. And it will tell you what fires you up, and it'll tell you what gets you angry. And it's not like a horoscope. When I read through them, I could pick out which one my brother was. I could pick out which one my wife was. I, of course, knew which one I was. And it's helped me be a better brother to my brother and a better husband to Megan. It'll probably help you understand employees. It'll probably help you understand your kids better. What I've learned is I can use those Enneagrams to design characters. So I can say, hey, I kind of want Matt Damon and the talented Mr. Ripley. I kind of want a creator like that. I'll go to Enneagram and I'll figure out which one he was, and it would tell me everything I need to know about that character. I mean, it's pretty amazing. So I haven't heard of any other writers using that to create characters, but I've used it, and it's been wonderful.